For almost 30 years, the most powerful men in America stared at a wall of rock and admitted they were stuck. The wall was the Allegheny Front, the eastern rampart of the Allegheny Mountains, and it ran like a locked door across the middle of Pennsylvania. Everything the young United States wanted in the 1840s sat on the far side of it. The farms of Ohio, the pork of Cincinnati, the endless promise of the West, and the men in Philadelphia who believed their city was the rightful capital of American commerce could not reach any of it. The mountain would not let them through. They had tried everything. In 1834, the state of Pennsylvania finished a contraption so strange it embarrassed engineers for a generation. It was called the Allegheny Portage Railroad, and the idea was to drag canal boats up and over the mountain on a series of inclined planes, hauling them with stationary steam engines and ropes, lifting entire vessels foot by foot up the slope and lowering them down the other side. It worked. Barely. It froze in winter. The ropes snapped. A journey that should have taken hours took days. Everyone who used it understood they were watching a temporary answer to a permanent problem, and the problem was getting worse because a rival 300 miles to the north was about to win the entire continent. In New York, the Erie Canal had already proven that whoever connected the Atlantic coast to the interior would control the wealth of a nation. New York City was exploding. Baltimore was building the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad straight toward the Ohio River. Philadelphia, the birthplace of the country, the city of Independence Hall, was being strangled by its own geography. The merchants did the math and arrived at a terrifying conclusion. If they did not get through the Alleghenies, and soon, their city would slide into second place and never climb out. So in 1846, the Pennsylvania legislature chartered a private company to do what the state had failed to do. They called it the Pennsylvania Railroad. Its mission was almost insultingly simple to state and almost impossible to execute. Build a railroad from Harrisburg across the mountains to Pittsburgh. Connect the two halves of the state. Beat the mountain that had beaten everyone. The problem was that nobody knew how. A steam locomotive in the 1840s was a weak, temperamental machine. It could pull a respectable load on flat ground, but it could not climb. Put it on a steep grade and the wheels would simply spin, polished steel sliding on polished steel, the whole train sitting still while the engine screamed. The Allegheny Front rose more than 1,000 feet in a brutally short distance. By every rule of railroading then understood, you could not run a train up it. The grade was too severe. The curves required would be too sharp. It was, the skeptics said, a waste of investors' money to even try. This is the moment the entire story turns on. Not a battle, not a gold strike, not a president, a single engineering decision made by a single man that would conjure an entire city out of empty ground and change the map of the United States. His name was John Edgar Thompson, and he was the chief engineer of the new railroad. Thompson was a Quaker's son from Delaware, quiet, exacting, almost cold in his precision. He had walked railroad surveys since he was a teenager, and he had studied the great rail lines of England. He looked at the Allegheny Front the way a chess player looks at a board that seems already lost, and he found the move nobody else could see. Thompson refused to fight the mountain head-on. You could not climb the slope directly, so he would not try. Instead, he would make the train climb sideways. He would wrap the railroad around the contours of the mountain itself, stretching the distance to soften the grade. curving the line back on itself so that a locomotive could gain altitude gradually, the way a hiker switches back and forth up a steep trail instead of charging straight at the summit. To do it, he needed a place at the foot of the mountain, a base, a staging ground where the assault on the Alleghenies could be launched and supplied, where engines could be built and repaired, where the men who would carve the impossible curve into the rock could live. There was no town there. There was almost nothing there at all, just farmland in a valley called Logan's Valley, owned by a family named Robeson, sitting in the shadow of the mountain that had stopped a nation for 30 years. In 1849, the Pennsylvania Railroad quietly began buying that land. They were about to draw a city onto a blank page, and the only reason it would exist, the only reason any of it would exist, was to defeat a mountain. They would name the place Altoona. There is a place on the side of a Pennsylvania mountain where a train traveling west will, for about 45 seconds, point itself directly back at the east it came from. It looks wrong. A passenger glancing out the window can see the rear cars of his own train across a deep green valley running parallel to him in the opposite direction, as if time had folded. The locomotive is hauling the whole train around a curve so tight, so deliberately exaggerated, that the line nearly doubles back on itself. From the air, it forms an almost perfect U, a horseshoe pressed into the flank of the Allegheny Front. And every engineer who has ever seen it understands that this shape is not an accident of the landscape. It is the answer to John Edgar Thompson's impossible problem drawn in steel. Thompson's insight had been simple to say and savage to build. If a locomotive could not climb a steep grade directly, then you stretched the track until the grade became gentle enough to climb. But the Allegheny Front did not give you room to stretch. The mountain rose too fast, so Thompson found a notch in the range, a spot where two ridges came together around the head of a ravine called Kittanning Gap, and he made a decision that defined American railroading. He would run the track deep into the ravine along one wall, bend it all the way around the head of the valley in a single sweeping curve, and bring it back out along the opposite wall, now higher up the mountain. The detour bought him distance. The distance bought him altitude. The horseshoe shape let a train gain hundreds of feet of elevation without ever facing a grade it could not pull. It was elegant on paper. On the ground, it had to be torn out of solid mountain by hand. Construction began in the early 1850s, and there were no machines to do it. There were no bulldozers, no power shovels, no dynamite as we know it today. There were men, picks, shovels, black powder, horse carts, and time. Most of those men were Irish immigrants, thousands of them, who had crossed an ocean fleeing famine and found work on the most ambitious railroad project in the country. They lived in rough camps along the mountainside. They drilled blasting holes by hand, one man holding an iron rod while another swung a hammer, trusting his partner's aim in the dark of a rock cut. They filled cart after cart with broken stone and earth and hauled it away to build up the embankments on the outer edge of the curve, because the horseshoe was not only carved into the mountain, it was partly built out from it, a shelf of fill packed against the slope to carry the rails across the gap. The work was dangerous in the quiet, ordinary way that great projects of that century were dangerous. Rockfalls, premature blasts, the simple arithmetic of moving enormous weight with human muscle. The full human cost was never precisely recorded. The way so much immigrant labor of the era went uncounted, but the men who built the curve knew what it asked of them, and they finished it anyway. On February 15, 1854, the Horseshoe Curve opened to traffic. The effect was immediate and total. For the first time, a continuous railroad ran from Philadelphia across the Allegheny Mountains to Pittsburgh, and from Pittsburgh the rails reached toward the entire interior of the continent. The strange contraption of inclined planes that had hauled canal boats over the summit, the Allegheny Portage Railroad, was suddenly obsolete. Within a few years it was abandoned outright. The mountain that had stopped a nation for 30 years had been beaten not by force but by geometry, and the consequences rippled far past Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania Railroad now had a clear path west, and it used that path to become the largest and most powerful corporation in the United States, a company that would one day call itself, without much exaggeration, the Standard Railroad of the world. Philadelphia got its lifeline to the interior. Pittsburgh's steel could move east. The whole economic center of gravity of the young country shifted, and it shifted because of a single curve on a single mountainside. But the curve needed tending. A grade that steep, a line that critical, demanded constant work. Locomotives had to be maintained for the climb. Helper engines had to be added to push heavy trains up the grade and held in check on the way down. Crews had to live within reach of the mountain, ready at all hours. And there, at the foot of the great climb, in the valley the railroad had bought 5 years earlier, all of that work began to gather in one place. The curve had moved the map of America. Now the place at the bottom of it was about to become a city. Its name was Altoona, and it was about to build the machines that ran the world. By the early 1900s, there was a place in central Pennsylvania where a brand new locomotive could be chained down, fired up to full power, and forced to run as hard as it possibly could, at a dead standstill, while engineers stood beside it with notebooks, measuring its soul. The machine would roar. Its driving wheels would spin against giant rollers set into the floor, the whole locomotive straining forward against its restraints, burning coal and throwing steam, going absolutely nowhere, and the men watching would record everything. How much coal it ate, how much water it boiled, how much power it actually delivered versus how much it wasted. It was a torture chamber for engines, and there was nothing else quite like it on Earth. This was the Pennsylvania Railroad's locomotive testing plant at Altoona, and it tells you what Altoona had become. This was no longer a town that merely repaired trains. This was a town that interrogated them, perfected them, and reinvented them. Altoona had grown into the largest railroad workshop complex in the world, and the work done inside it set the standard that every other railroad on the planet tried to copy. The growth had been staggering. When the railroad first laid out the town in the 1850s, it was a cluster of shops and worker housing in a mountain valley. By the turn of the century, the Altoona works sprawled across hundreds of acres on the edge of the city, a dense landscape of erecting shops, machine shops, foundries, boiler shops, and rolling mills. Tens of thousands of men worked there. For decades, it was understood that almost everyone in Altoona either worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad or depended on someone who did, and the rhythm of the entire city was set by the shop whistle. When it blew, Altoona went to work. When it blew again, Altoona went home. What they built there was extraordinary in scale. This was one of the only places in the country where a great railroad designed and constructed its own locomotives from the ground up, rather than simply buying them from an outside builder. Raw iron and steel went in one end of the complex. Finished locomotives, some of the most powerful in the world, came out the other. The shops also turned out freight cars and passenger cars by the tens of thousands, an entire industrial ecosystem feeding the appetite of a railroad that stretched across the eastern United States. But the deepest source of Altoona's pride was not the quantity, it was the knowledge. The testing plant made Altoona a place where locomotive design was treated as a science, rather than a craft handed down by guesswork. Engineers there studied combustion, steam pressure, drawbar pull, fuel efficiency. They ran experiments that other railroads could only dream of. The designs that emerged from this work, particularly the heavy, reliable locomotives the Pennsylvania Railroad became famous for, were studied and imitated far beyond Pennsylvania. When people called the company the standard railroad of the world, this was a large part of what they meant. The standard was being written in Altoona, and the men who wrote it knew it. There was a culture inside those shops, a fierce, specific pride in mastery. A boilermaker, a machinist, a pattern maker in Altoona was not an anonymous laborer. He was part of an institution that the rest of the industry measured itself against. Skills were passed from father to son. Generations of the same family walked through the same shop gates. Boys grew up assuming they would build locomotives because in Altoona that was simply what a man did. The city built churches, schools, theaters, ball fields, a downtown of solid brick and stone, all of it resting on the foundation of the works. The numbers tell part of it. Altoona's population, almost nothing in 1850, climbed past 50,000 and kept climbing, cresting somewhere above 80,000 at the city's industrial peak. It became one of the most important manufacturing centers in Pennsylvania, a state that was itself the industrial heart of the nation. People who had never heard of the place still depended on it, because the trains that carried America's coal, steel, grain, soldiers, and mail had been built, tuned, and proven on the side of that mountain. There was, of course, a quiet vulnerability buried inside all this triumph, though almost no one in Altoona would have wanted to name it in those years. The city's genius, its entire identity, was bound to a single technology and a single company. The locomotives Altoona perfected were steam locomotives, and the science being practiced so brilliantly in that testing plant was the science of a machine whose days, though no one yet believed it, were already being counted somewhere far away. For now, though, Altoona stood at the summit of its powers, and the world was about to ask the city and its great curve to help win a war. In June of 1942, 4 men climbed out of the Atlantic surf onto a beach on Long Island in the dark, carrying explosives and cash, and one of the places on their target list was a curve in the mountains of Pennsylvania. They were German agents put ashore by a submarine as part of a sabotage mission the Nazi command called Operation Pastorius. A second team had landed days earlier in Florida. Their assignment was to cripple the American war machine from the inside by attacking the infrastructure that fed it, factories, plants, and the rail lines that tied them all together. And among the strategic points German intelligence had identified as worth destroying was the Horseshoe Curve at Altoona. Think about what that means. On the other side of the ocean, military planners studying how to break the United States looked at a map of American railroads and put their finger on a single bend of track on the side of one mountain. Not a city, not a harbor, a curve, because they understood something that Altoona had always known, and the rest of the country was about to relearn. Almost everything moving between the industrial East and the rest of the nation had to climb that grade. Sever the curve and you would not just stop trains. You would put a knife into the supply line of a continent at war. The plot failed. It failed quickly and almost completely, undone by betrayal from within the German team itself, and the saboteurs were captured by the FBI before they could strike anything at all. The Horseshoe Curve was never touched, but the fact that it had been named as a target tells you exactly how important Altoona had become by the early 1940s. The curve that John Edgar Thompson had carved into the mountain 90 years earlier was now considered, by America's enemies, one of the most strategically valuable points in the country, and the people guarding it took that seriously. Through the war years, the Horseshoe Curve was watched. Guards were posted, access was restricted, lights, fences, and patrols protected a piece of railroad that, in peacetime, families had once visited like a scenic overlook. The nation understood that this stretch of rail was, quite literally, a weapon, and it had to be defended like one. Because what moved across that curve during the Second World War is almost hard to picture now. The Pennsylvania Railroad became one of the great arteries of the American war effort, and the Horseshoe Curve was the choke point through which a staggering share of it flowed. Troop trains, car after car of young men in uniform, climbed the grade day and night, bound for ports and training camps. Freight trains hauled steel from Pittsburgh, coal from the Pennsylvania fields, tanks, guns, ammunition, fuel, food, and raw material, the entire physical substance of a country converting itself into the arsenal of a global war. The line ran at a tempo that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. Trains stacked one behind another, the grade never quiet, the helper engines at Altoona working without rest to push the heaviest loads up and over the mountain. And Altoona itself worked the way it had always worked, only harder. The shops ran flat out. The men who built and maintained the locomotives kept the machines moving under a load the system had never carried before. The skill that the city had spent a century perfecting was now poured directly into the war. Every repaired boiler and rebuilt engine, a small contribution to keeping the great river of war traffic flowing across the Allegheny Front. For a few years, Altoona stood at the absolute center of American power, a mountain town whose curve and whose shops helped carry a nation to victory. It was the city's finest hour, and buried inside it was the beginning of the end, because the war that demanded so much steam power also accelerated the technology that would make steam power obsolete. The diesel-electric locomotive, still a novelty in the 1930s, proved itself during these years. It was more efficient. It needed less maintenance. It did not require the vast network of repair shops, water stops, and coaling facilities that steam demanded. It could run farther with fewer men tending it. Quietly, on other railroads and in other shops, the future was arriving, and the future did not run on the kind of locomotive Altoona had built its identity around. Altoona had just helped win a war on the strength of the steam locomotive. The cruel irony was that the steam locomotive had, in that same war, signed its own death warrant. The machines the city had perfected over 4 generations were about to become relics, and almost no one in Altoona yet understood how fast it would happen. The whistle was still blowing, but it was running out of time. On the 21st of June, 1970, the railroad that built Altoona filed for bankruptcy, and at that moment it was the largest corporate collapse in the history of the United States. It did not happen all at once. Nothing this large ever does. The fall of the Pennsylvania Railroad and of the city that lived and breathed by it came the way the diesel had warned it would come. Quietly at first, then all at once, then irreversibly. And the cruelty of it was that the city did almost nothing wrong. Altoona had built brilliant machines, perfected a science, helped win a war. It was simply standing on top of a technology when that technology died beneath it. The diesel-electric locomotive finished what the war had started. Through the 1950s, railroad after railroad retired its steam fleet, and the Pennsylvania Railroad was no exception. The diesel did not need the enormous apparatus that steam required. It did not need the coaling towers, the water stops, the endless boiler repairs, and so it did not need Altoona, not the way steam had needed it. The vast shop complex that had once employed tens of thousands had been built to serve a kind of machine that was vanishing from the rails. One by one, the great shops began to fall silent. The work shrank. The jobs evaporated. The men who had assumed their sons would build locomotives watched the gates close on a way of life that had lasted 4 generations. Then came the merger, the desperate move of a dying giant. By the 1960s, the Pennsylvania Railroad and its oldest rival, the New York Central, were both bleeding money, battered by competition from trucks on the new interstate highways and from airlines in the sky. The forces pulling freight and passengers off the rails were larger than any single company, rooted in decades of national policy that had poured public money into roads and runways, while the railroads were left to fend for themselves. In 1968, the two old enemies merged into a single company, Penn Central, hoping that together they might survive. They did not. The two railroads could not be successfully fused. Their systems clashed, their cultures clashed. Freight got lost. Losses mounted into millions of dollars a day, and on that June day in 1970, the whole thing collapsed into bankruptcy, sending a shock through Wall Street and the nation. For Altoona, this was not a financial headline. It was the end of the world it had always known. The empire that had drawn the city onto a blank page in 1849, the empire whose whistle had set the rhythm of every Altoona morning for over a century, was gone. Out of the wreckage, the government eventually assembled new entities, the passenger system Amtrak in 1971, and the freight system Conrail in 1976, stitched together from the remains of Penn Central and other failed railroads. The trains kept running, but the company that had made Altoona and the world of work it represented did not come back. The city paid the price for the rest of the century. Altoona's population, once above 80,000 at its peak, fell and kept falling, eventually settling closer to 40,000, roughly half of what it had been. The shops that had defined the place dwindled to a fraction of their former size. A city that had once stood at the center of American industry slipped out of the national memory almost entirely. Ask an American today to name the place where the locomotives that ran the country were built and tested, and most will have no answer. The name has faded. The creator was forgotten. And yet, go to that mountain today, and the Horseshoe Curve is still there, not as a ruin, not as a monument behind a fence, as a working piece of railroad. More than 170 years after Irish laborers tore it out of the Allegheny Front by hand, trains still climb that grade, still bend around the great U, still point themselves briefly back east before continuing west. The freight of Norfolk Southern rolls across it. Amtrak passengers ride it. The rails are bright with use. The curve that John Edgar Thompson imagined with a logarithmic rule that beat a mountain which had stopped a nation for 30 years still does precisely the job he designed it to do. That is the strange, hard truth at the center of Altoona's story. The empire that created the city is dead. The company is gone. The shops are mostly silent, but the miracle the city built outlived the empire that built it. Altoona made something more permanent than the power that made Altoona. The whistle stopped. The curve never did.